welcome to this special broadcast on WION. My name is Mohammed Saleh. Now, to mark 80 years since the end of the Second World War, which the Chinese, of course, regard as their war of resistance against Japanese aggression, China today put out its largest ever military parade. Now, dozens of world leaders, mostly from non-Western nations, attended the event. But it was the grand entrance of Xi Jinping, accompanied by Russia's Vladimir Putin and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, that has grabbed the most attention. Now, other important attendees included the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, the Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto, and Myanmar's junta chief Min Aung Hlaing. Now, leaders from the West, predominantly from the United States, Western Europe, Japan, and South Korea, were not in attendance. Now, the highly choreographed display and also the formidable guest list were designed to send a message to the United States and its allies. But what exactly is this message that China is now trying to send across? And what does this mean for the changing global world order? To discuss this, we're joined in this broadcast by Mr. Collins Chong Yew Keat. He's a foreign affairs and a security strategist at the University of Malaya. Mr. Keat, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. And let me start off by asking you this. You know, the complete pomp and splendor that was put out on display by China, what is the message that's being sent out here, and what does it signify for the global world order?
Well, it is a calculated message to both parties, to the West and, of course, to potential adversaries in the region. We have seen how this is a direct response to Trump. And, of course, also China wants to show to the world that it is coming of age now in terms of power. And, of course, the grand display of its military capacity, its new, assets on display, and also, of course, to, the intention to rewrite historical perspective on the end of the Second World War. Of course, also in projecting, elevating the status of China as and downgrading and downplaying the role of the West in the Second World War. Also, this is a direct message also to Taiwan as a direct deterrence, as a warning to Taiwan that it's a futile effort for Taiwan to challenge China's power might, and of course also is a subtle message also to potential adversaries, including Japan and South Korea. And of course, as a direct response, as a direct signaling to Trump and Washington that despite the tariff measures, despite efforts to isolate China, China is gaining strength in terms of friend-shoring efforts in having more allies and potential allies, hot on the heels of the SCO summit in Tianjin, and now this grand military display, and of course the ability to court and to get the support of all these players, all in the line of the alternative system. So now China wants to show to the world that it is now ready, and the world should have trust and confidence in China to lead the alternative system. Of course, it does not go down well with Trump and the West, but I foresee that despite the support of Jong, despite his presence in this parade, despite the presence of Putin, mutual wariness and suspicions are still there. And of course, also Beijing has growing, in terms of concerns on Jong-un's part to be closer to Moscow. And despite the no-limit ties between Moscow and Beijing, we have seen also historical perspective. There's always this mutual suspicion between the two, and it remains to be seen as to the extent of Chinese intent here.
Interesting. Now, we'll talk about the uneasy, equation that China has with some of its regional allies here. But this was a parade that was watched very closely in different capitals around the world. And one individual, one leader who made it abundantly clear that he was clearly watching the Chinese pageantry was the American President Donald Trump, who put out a social media post saying that the Chinese President Xi Jinping is in fact conspiring by having Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un alongside him. And he also, in many ways, I would say, asked the Chinese president, was China remembering the role played by the United States of America in the Second World War, in the defeat of the Japanese forces back then? How do you think that social media post by Donald Trump would be viewed in Beijing?
Well, they have always anticipated this response from Trump, and this is what Trump has been stating has been true. That the efforts by China now to display, to showcase its efforts, to project strength, to project power, and the ability to court different partners, all with the U.S. in mind. So this has been the efforts by China all along. And of course, Trump aggravated the situation by the tariff measures and by the different coercion and containment measures against China. but this, calculated, projected image of the coming together of different powers to challenge the rules-based order, to challenge the US-led world order, has been years in the making now. And of course, also we have seen now the China and Jinping also is trying to gain higher leverage. And the same goes for Jong in terms of negotiating with Trump, negotiating with Washington, having this ability to showcase his might, not only in economic terms, but also in terms of geopolitical might, and of course also in security capacity and defense and power projection in terms of hard power capacity. So down the line, we are well aware of the potential of meeting Trump, and this is a showcase of elevating the chips and cards of Beijing and also Pyongyang.
Right. Now, the rules-based order you mentioned that came into existence after the Second World War, a lot of people would say that it is Donald Trump, through his tariff war, who is perhaps doing the heavy lifting to scuttle this rules-based order that came into existence after the Second World War. Do you think Donald Trump's tariff war has pushed countries such as Russia, India and China together, which are not necessarily natural partners?
I don't think so. I don't buy that, because this has been in the making for years now, even before Trump 1.0. So we have seen that happening, and of course also due to some of the weak leadership shown by predecessor President Obama. And of course what Trump has been doing now is to regain the strength of the US, to get the wealth back to the US, and of course to revive the mighty American power force, power projection, and to extend the power gap between Washington and Beijing. So this is being feared by Beijing. And you can see now the declining prospect of the Chinese economy, the declining prospect of the Chinese demographic capacity as compared to the US. And of course, also with all the tariff measures in place, we have seen now this gap being widened. Of course, there are certain areas where China is leading, and Trump is adamant in making sure that this is being addressed. And this theory of a peaking China, now it's China at its peak, and of course also the fear of this eventual downward spiral, has pushed China to be more assertive, to be more bellicose in terms of its actions, whether in South China Sea or in pushing Taiwan. So, with Trump in place now, they are now being increasingly cornered. And of course, also we can see that his 100-year marathon has now been challenged by Trump. And, the need for China to display that is ability to challenge, to rival US-led global order has not been diminished. But we can see that in reality, on the ground, that this is not happening, and Trump and Washington still have the higher leverage in bargaining chips and cards, despite what Jinping has been trying to portray and trying to convince the world otherwise.
It's interesting that you mentioned that this is quite clearly something that Donald Trump is trying to do to strengthen the United States of America and make it much more richer. But by doing what he's doing, he seems to be alienating his own friends, and he's probably making his adversaries look at him with more suspicion. Do you think this tariff war by Donald Trump is actually strengthening the United States, or has it now alienated the rest of the world and has made the rest of the world look at America with a lot more suspicion?
Well, to a certain extent, it might be so, but on the bigger scheme of things, we have seen how Trump is right when he argued that the rest of the world depends on the U.S. rather than the U.S. is in need of the rest of the world, because the U.S. market being the biggest in the world, of course also the U.S. security umbrella, and of course also and the need for Trump to readjust, to reset this unjust and the system of the tariff and dependence by the other powers on the U.S., piggybacking, taking the U.S. for granted in terms of having this security umbrella and having this unfair tariff policy. So what Trump has been doing now is to ensure that the other powers pay their fair share and to have their own obligations to increase their defense spending, knowing that, despite all these efforts, players who are, at the direct line of, risk from the actions by China, especially Japan, South Korea, and the region, have always been depending on the U.S. for their own, defense and security deterrence and security umbrella. So this reality cannot be unchanged. And what Trump is doing now, of course, to increase the self-awareness and the reciprocal efforts by these powers to also show some support and reciprocal intention to help the U.S. in this regard to contain China and to ensure that peace and stability and rules-based order that has been safeguarded by Washington for the past decades have also now been met with the same obligation by this power. So I don't see that the post-Cold War or the post-World War, the world has been in denial, or they have been in denial of the role of the U.S. in maintaining this rules-based order and in maintaining the international maritime security, and which no other power has the capacity to do so until now. even for the next decades.
All right, interesting. My final question to you, Mr. Keat, is this. I want you to look into the future. Donald Trump is going to be the president of the United States for 3+ more years. But after that, there will be a change of guard in Washington. Do you think this new sort of a grouping of coming together of nations in the South, of what is known as the Global South, this is something that can sustain once Donald Trump is out of the White House?
Well, I don't see that to be receding in terms of this capacity or the intent by China to consolidate, to synergize its own coalition building, to challenge the US-led order. Potential, runners for the next election. Of course, what we have seen with the case of Biden, despite what he has been saying, he has continued Trump's policies on China. He has continued Trump's tariffs on China. So nothing changed there based on domestic political needs and considerations. So this will be continued, for Trump's successors, whether it's from a Republican, whether it's a Democrat. I don't see that happening. China is still being seen as a primary, challenge, as a primary threat to the U.S. Of course, that's been seen as the biggest threat to the U.S. So, and as I've stated earlier, China is facing a time trap now. Xi Jinping is facing a time trap, for him to ensure that China's ambitions in a 100-year marathon and to ensure that, it surpasses the U.S. in all areas of power indicators has been, running short. So this is a time where a dangerous timeline for China to showcase that it's not being seen as weak and, for it to showcase greater power. So this is a time that we need more deterrence, and only the U.S. has the capacity to deter China from doing so.
All right, we'll have to leave there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Collins Chong Yew Keat, for joining us and getting us that perspective there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.